It's really cringe when theology nerds give themselves labels based on old, irrelevant, obscure theological controversies, but that's not going to stop me from doing it. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. And right now, I'm still in the Eastern Orthodox province of Christosia on this Christian Minecraft server. I'm right now in the capital city called Nikopol, and I'm going to explore this entire province. I'm going to explore all that the Eastern Orthodox Christians on my Minecraft server have built. They've built a lot of really beautiful stuff, so I'm going to make my way over to the train station so I can take the train. And yeah, while I do that, I'm going to be talking about New School Presbyterianism. You probably don't know that it exists, and that's because it doesn't exist. So that's the end of this video. No, it's not. It doesn't exist anymore, but it used to exist, because in the 1800s, the Presbyterian Church split over the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was this big movement in America, this big religious revival, and the Presbyterian Church split over whether to support it or not. So the old school Presbyterians didn't support it, and the new school Presbyterians did support it. So I'm going to talk about what the new school was, what they believed, and then in the second part of the video, I'm going to say why I don't agree with it, even though there was good and bad to both the old school and the new school. So here's some historical context. I said it was over the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, if you have taken AP US history, the Second Great Awakening was in the 1800s, and the First Great Awakening was in the 1700s. And both were kind of similar. Both were religious revivals that moved away from traditional models of church, traditional doctrine, traditional focus on the sacraments, and more to an internal, personal, subjective religious experience. So you can see why some people might be opposed to that. Some more traditional Christians would say, no, we can't neglect the visible church. We can't neglect the sacraments. We can't neglect the church fathers. We can't neglect the liturgy. The traditional Protestants were talking like this. So that's why a lot of the Protestant churches split both times over the First and Second Great Awakening. In the First Great Awakening, the Protestant churches split into the Old Lights, the Old Light who did not support it, and the New Lights, or the New Light, who did support it. In the Presbyterian Church specifically, the Old Light was called the Old Side, and the New Light was called the New Side. But once the First Great Awakening died down, the two sides reunited, and there was one Presbyterian Church once again. The division over the First Great Awakening lasted only 17 years. I'm not sure which track to go to. I guess I'll try... I should have looked at a train map or something. I guess I'll go to... Yeah, I guess I'll go to here. Why not? I'm taking a random gamble. Okay, let's get this going, and yay, I'm on the train. So the Second Great Awakening was a bit more extreme than the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was all about getting people to personally convert, to have a personal conversion experience. But the First Great Awakening in the Presbyterian Church was still pretty traditionally Calvinist. The main Calvinist figure in the First Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards, but a lot of the people in the Second Great Awakening took his ideas and absolutely ran with them and made them a lot more extreme. So the Second Great Awakening was influenced by a lot of the followers of Edwards, by a lot of the successors of Edwards, who took his theology and made it even more extreme. So sometimes this is called Edwardsian theology, because Edwards was in New England. Sometimes it was called New England theology, because he was specifically in New Haven, Connecticut. Sometimes it's called New Haven theology. And because his main successor was Samuel Hopkins, and because Samuel Hopkins made his theology a bit more extreme, sometimes it's called Hopkinsian theology. But either way, sometimes it's called the New Divinity, because it is sort of a revision of Calvinism. The Second Great Awakening basically revised traditional Calvinism to make it better at converting people. So there were many aspects of New School Presbyterianism. One aspect was they started teaching a new version of Calvinism. Another aspect is they supported a lot of crazy revival measures. There was something called the anxious bench, where you'd have someone like sit on a bench and the pastor would just yell at them and get them to confess all their sins and squeeze a conversion out of them. Maybe it was effective. It was definitely not a traditional way of preaching the gospel, so that's why it was a bit controversial. But I want to focus more on the theology of the new school rather than the practices. There's a lot to know about the new school. Like, for example, they were a lot better than the old school at fighting slavery. The new school, for the most part, was very abolitionist. I mean, for a brief period of time, there was actually 4 Presbyterian churches in the U.S. There was the old school and the new school, and then during the Civil War, both the old and the new school split into North and South. But generally, even though there were some Southern New School Presbyterians, they were called the United Synod of the South, most of the New School Presbyterians were Northern and therefore very anti-slavery. So that was a good thing about the New School. What was not so good was they revised Calvinism to try and be better at converting people. There were several ways they did this. So it all starts with Jonathan Edwards. Now, Jonathan Edwards' version of predestination was basically traditional Calvinism, just with a slightly different emphasis. Traditional Calvinism teaches predestination, and Calvin didn't invent this, he just got it from St. Augustine. Predestination teaches that we are so sinful, we will not choose God unless God first chooses us. That means, and does God choose everyone? No, he only chooses some people. They're called the elect. So Calvinism teaches that, yes, we do choose God, but God first chooses us. He doesn't choose everyone. He only chooses a specific group of people called the elect. That's traditional Calvinism. The most common criticism of Calvinism is that it denies free will. So what did Jonathan Edwards do? Jonathan Edwards wanted to defend Calvinism, so he said, you know what? Calvinists do believe in free will. And, the Westminster Confession of Faith, traditional Calvinism has always affirmed free will, but Jonathan Edwards took it a step further. He said, yeah, of course we believe in free will. We believe that we have the free will to do whatever we want, but we're not going to want God unless God first changes our hearts. So the focus became about religious affections. Jonathan Edwards says, yes, we do have free will. We have the free will to do whatever we love, but our affections or our love is disordered because of original sin. Because we are all born in sin, we are born hating God, and we are born doing things for selfish motivations, for selfish affections, and we will not or cannot be saved until God changes our affections. So for Jonathan Edwards, there is a big shift in focus from the eternal decrees of God in Calvinism to personal affections. That was a pretty significant shift in Calvinist theology, even though Jonathan Edwards himself didn't deny any of the core tenets of Calvinism. I mean, he wasn't great on the sacraments, but none of the American theologians, except John Williamson Nevin, were great on the sacraments. But his successors, following his theology, sort of ran with it and started to deny some aspects of traditional Calvinism. Like Samuel Hopkins, for example. Samuel Hopkins was his successor, and he basically revised all of Calvinism, and that's what is known as the New Divinity, and that's what the theology of the New School Presbyterian Church usually was. So people like Samuel Hopkins and Nathaniel William Taylor, these prominent New School Presbyterians, they began basically denying original sin. Original sin is part of Western Augustinian doctrine. It's not just a Calvinist doctrine, it's a Western Christian Augustinian doctrine. If you're a Western Christian, meaning a Catholic or a traditional Protestant, then you have to affirm original sin, because that is what the Western Christian Church has always taught. Original sin means that because of Adam's sin, all of us are guilty of that from the moment of conception. From the moment of conception, we all deserve to go to hell. Augustine also taught that because of original sin, our wills are enslaved to sin and cannot be freed unless God first frees it. And God doesn't do that for everyone. God only does that to the elect. So that means the non-elect do not have the free will to choose God. And Samuel Hopkins, following Jonathan Edwards, who did want to focus on free will, did not like this. The New Divinity, the New School Presbyterians, made 2 corrections, or they thought it was corrections. They made 2 changes to traditional Calvinist doctrine. They said, number 1, we are not guilty of original sin. We suffer the effects of original sin, but we're not actually guilty of it. That's similar to what the Eastern Orthodox Church teaches on original sin. That's why I'm in the Eastern Orthodox province today. So traditional Calvinism has a more Roman Catholic, Augustinian doctrine of original sin, and the New School has more of a Eastern Orthodox concept of original sin. At least it's similar. They say, no, we are not guilty of original sin, we are only guilty of actual sins, and we have a sinful inclination because of the effects of Adam's sin, but no, we're not actually guilty of what Adam did, because we weren't there, we weren't in the Garden of Eden, we didn't do that. And furthermore, they said, Obviously, we must have the ability to come to Christ, because if we didn't, God wouldn't tell us to come to Christ. They said that ought implies can. If we ought to do something, that implies that we actually have the ability to do it. Now, both of these things are things that Pelagius said. Pelagius was an ancient heretic in the 5th century, and Augustine refuted his theology. He was Augustine's main opponent. So you can see, in the new school Presbyterianism, in the new divinity, there is a shift away from Augustine and towards Pelagius. So here's why I am not new school. I think that despite trying to still fit in with Calvinist theology, New School Presbyterianism really adopts a Pelagian view of humanity and tries to somehow make that fit with Calvinism. Problem is, it doesn't fit. So prominent New School Presbyterians include like Albert Barnes and Lyman Beecher, and both of them try to still affirm predestination. They both try and still affirm that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, but because they are starting with a denial of total depravity, they end up denying the rest of Calvinism. Like, someone who tries to be more moderate on this would be Lyman Beecher, or Albert Barnes, who really carefully deflected the charges of heresy that were raised against them. And they were accused of heresy for this by the Presbyterian Church. The New School Presbyterians were kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, and what really happened is there were several presbyteries that were teaching New School theology, so the Presbyterian Church kicked them out, so the original Presbyterian Church became known as the Old School, and the new Presbyterian Church that got kicked out became known as the New School. So the way that they tried to reconcile a Pelagian view of humanity with Calvinism was they said, we have the free will to do whatever we want, and God wouldn't tell us to do something if we didn't have the ability to do it, but we're just not going to want to do it unless God first has some sort of moral influence in our life. The reason they said this was they wanted to try and be better at converting people. It's a lot easier to evangelize to people and to convert people if you think that your moral influence can actually have an impact on whether or not they come to Christ. So it was really valuing pragmatism over correct doctrine. That was the original motivation. It was also the Enlightenment, which really thought that free will was a necessary part of being human, and they didn't think free will was compatible with traditional Calvinism. Now, traditional Calvinism does not deny free will, but the Enlightenment philosophers didn't think it was compatible, so a lot of these New School Presbyterians had to try and revise Calvinism to make it compatible with this Enlightenment concept of free will. Because the Westminster Confession, the traditional Calvinist statement of faith, does affirm that we have free will, but what it means by free will is not what our post-Enlightenment philosophy means by free will. When the Westminster Confession says we have free will, what they mean is not that we are libertarian agents that can just do whatever. What they mean is we have the power to choose between multiple goods. It does not mean that we actually will. Now, the New School Presbyterianism, a lot of them adopted a more libertarian notion of free will, a free will that contradicts the notion that God controls everything. Calvinists have always affirmed that God controls everything. It's called the doctrine of providence. And this is a very beautiful part of the world, by the way. I like these biomes. That's the doctrine of providence. Traditional Calvinism does not think it contradicts free will, but a lot of the New School Presbyterians, just like the Enlightenment philosophers, did, so that's why they started to deny the idea that God actually controls everything in the universe. And they also began to deny that God controls who will and will not be saved. Although the more moderate New School Presbyterians like Lyman Beecher and Albert Barnes tried to hold those ideas in tension, the more radical New School Presbyterians like Charles Finney ended up blatantly denying that and becoming blatant, not just Arminians, but semi-Pelagians. Sometimes even a full-blown Pelagian. Charles Finney was very extreme. He had a lot of very extreme revival measures. Sometimes he even preached blatant works-based salvation. And he did do a lot of good things too. So he wasn't like all bad. Okay, looks like this is the border between the provinces. Looks like this is the non-denominational province. I'm going to stay in the Eastern Orthodox province for this episode. I'll explore more of the non-denominational one in the next one. But yeah, Charles Finney founded Oberlin College, Oberlin to teach his theological beliefs. Most of America's famous universities were started for some theological purpose. Now, I do have a soft spot for Oberlin, because Oberlin is where I became a Christian. Oberlin is where I got saved. I guess the revival tactics worked on me just 150 years later. I didn't attend Oberlin as a college student. I was at a summer camp that was hosted at Oberlin when I was 14. It was hosted by a Christian Oberlin professor. But still, I always have a soft spot for Oberlin. But it was founded by a very sketchy New School Presbyterian, Charles Finney. Now, another famous American university was very good at refuting the theology of the New School. Princeton University, Princeton Seminary, was the main Old School Presbyterian university. And the main Old School Presbyterians during the 1800s were people like Charles Hodge and William G.T. Shedd. And in the South, in the Southern Old School, you had like James Henry Thornwell and Robert Louis Dabney. Dabney's kind of controversial because he was a very strong supporter of slavery, and he also had a very low view of the sacraments, and he sort of denied divine simplicity. He was not the best theologian overall, but Charles Hodge and William G.T. Shedd were quite good. Quite good at refuting the errors. They were the Old School Presbyterians. They were the Presbyterians that kicked out the New School Presbyterians for having a lot of agreement with Pelagius on how they saw humanity. So Charles Hodge and William G.T. Shedd firmly defended traditional Calvinist doctrines like predestination, like original sin, like total depravity, and like limited atonement. Limited atonement is the idea that while the atonement that Christ made on the cross is sufficient for everyone, has enough value to cover the sins of all, it was only intended to cover the sins of those who will believe. That's what limited atonement teaches. R.C. Sproul says it's better defined as definite atonement, that the atonement of Christ did not die to potentially save people. Christ died to actually save people. So that means Christ only died for those who will believe. But a lot of the New School Presbyterians denied the traditional Calvinist doctrine of limited atonement, became, 4-point Calvinists, but because some of them denied total depravity, they became like 3-point Calvinists, and many of them just ended up becoming 0-point Calvinists, you know what I mean? But the reason they denied limited atonement is they thought it was better, it made it easier to preach the gospel if you think Christ just died for everyone without exception. But you don't need to do that. You can still preach the gospel to people if you believe in limited atonement. You can still say that Christ died for everyone, just not in the same way. Christ died for all sufficiently, and died for the elect efficiently. I used to think that this was called hypothetical universalism. Turns out hypothetical universalism is saying more than that, which I wouldn't necessarily affirm. I'm just affirming a classic view of limited atonement that was defended by Charles Hodge and William G.T. Shedd and those guys. They were very good. The Old School Presbyterians were very good at defending traditional predestination. They were not the best at defending traditional notions of the sacraments. Charles Hodge had a pretty low sacramentology, just like Dabney did. But the thing is, it's not like the New School was good on the sacraments. Just because the Old School was bad doesn't mean the New School is good. The only two theologians I know of during the 1800s who actually held to Calvin's view of the sacraments were John Williamson Nevin, who was I had made a video about him and how he's better than Charles Hodge at a lot of things. That video is called Mercersburg Theology. There's also John Bailey Adger, who was another Southern Old School Presbyterian, who defended Calvin's view of the sacraments against Dabney, who was sort of denying it. Okay, I've officially moved all the way from the urban to the rural areas of this province. This is rural Christosia here. It's basically the wilderness. So that's about it for this video, but before I go, I want to explain the influence of New School Presbyterianism today. Now, the new divinity is dead. Nobody believes in New School Presbyterian theology anymore. You will not come across someone today who's like, "Hi, my theology is Hopkinsian theology. I affirm New School Calvinism. I affirm the new divinity where I believe in predestination, but I also reconcile that with a Pelagian anthropology." No one's going to say that. But, I mean, maybe if you're watching this video, you might just decide to affirm it for whatever reason. No one affirms that today. But the effects of the New School are still present today. I talk a lot about the differences between mainline and evangelical Protestantism. Both have their ups and downs. The good part about mainline Protestantism is it's very institutional. It's very traditional. The bad part about mainline Protestantism is it's not strict on doctrine. You have a lot of people who get away with heresy in the mainline Protestant churches, and that's what I'm trying to fix with Operation Reconquista. The good thing about evangelical Protestantism is that generally it cares about doctrine. Generally it cares about correct doctrine. The bad thing about evangelical Protestantism is it does not really care about maintaining the Christian institutions. It's very decentralized, very anti-institutional. Institutional evangelicalism barely exists. I think maybe it does in the Southern Baptist Convention, but that's about it. Generally, evangelicalism is dominated by non-denominational Christianity and by low church tendencies. So, the mainlines are more high church, more traditional, but very loose on doctrine, and the evangelicals are more strict on doctrine, but very low church, very anti-institutional. The new school had both the bad parts of both mainline and evangelical Christianity. The new school was both loose on doctrine and anti-institutional. The Second Great Awakening revivalism, it was both loose on the actual theology, loose on Calvinist doctrine, and a move away from the traditional Presbyterian institutions. Another thing that characterized the new school was parachurch ministries. If you're evangelical, parachurch ministries are all over the place. You work for these Christian organizations that are not necessarily affiliated with a denomination. That tendency came from the new school. They were anti-institutional. They were also loose on theology. So that means the old school had the best of both worlds for the mainline and the evangelical church. The old school Presbyterians cared a lot about the traditional Presbyterian institutions. They also cared a lot about traditional Presbyterian doctrine. So even though the old school wasn't perfect, because both sides in America during the 1800s didn't have the best sacramentology, except for John Williamson Nevin and like a few other random dudes like John Bailey Adger, they were better. So the effects of the new school, the effects of the Second Great Awakening, can be seen in both mainline and evangelical Protestantism today. The looseness on doctrine, the Presbyterians held the line very well on doctrine up until like the mid-20th century, or more like the early 20th century. The Presbyterians stayed conservative in their theology a lot longer than the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians, but they eventually fell. The new school marked the time when the Congregationalists started to abandon Calvinism and adopt heretical universalism even. The Presbyterians were always a lot more theologically conservative than the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians. But a lot of this theological liberalism started with the New School. And a lot of these low church tendencies in evangelical Protestantism today, a lot of these revivalist anti-institutional tendencies, they also came from the Second Great Awakening. So that means in the Presbyterian Church, they came from the New School Presbyterians. So there was one good thing about the New School, and that was that they were very good with social activism. So I will say they were good regarding that, but it's not like the old school was opposed to social activism. It's just that they put theology before social activism. And that's what I think we should do today. So thank you guys for watching this video. I'm going to keep recording on a speed up while I go mining here, and I will see you guys later.